Again, I go to these things and I sit there trying to form a discerning critical opinion. And what ends up happening is every time the radish spirit walks on stage, I'm like, heck yeah, I love the radish spirit. Oh, why am I like this? Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Joe and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. I'm a professional theatre critic here on social media, and I was recently invited to review Spirited Away, one of the hot tickets of the West End this summer. It is, of course, based on the Studio Ghibli film, and it has been brought miraculously to the stage with a combination of puppetry, a large ensemble cast in a Japanese production that has transferred to the UK. It is performed entirely in Japanese, but with English titles at the side of the stage. I don't know whether to call them subtitles, which is technically below, or surtitles, which is technically above. These are to either side. They're like surrounding titles, but they sort of fall mid-stage, so I don't know if you could really call them sub or so. I'm absolutely overthinking this. The arrival of Spirited Away in London, of course, comes on the heels of the success of the Olivier Award-winning My Neighbour Totoro, which has had 2 remarkably successful seasons at the Barbican Theatre in conjunction with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and has recently announced that it will transfer to London's West End in 2025, where it will open at the Gillian Lynne Theatre. But Totoro has already, like I said, won multiple Olivier Awards. It is now a bona fide West End hit, which begs the question, does Spirited Away, albeit created by a different theatre company from a different country, live up to that reputation? Simply put, is this as good as My Neighbour Totoro? Is it better? In today's full-length review video, I plan to answer that question, and if I have to lift this to the side of my head one more time, I'm going to become very muscular on one side, because this thing is heavy. It's huge! That's some thick page turning is what you're hearing right there. I honestly don't know if I could bench press this. The piece of paper you're seeing, by the way, is the cast list for this performance, because they do alternate. There you go. Now, when I reviewed Totoro back on its first run at the Barbican, I did so despite not having ever seen the film the whole way through. Spirited Away, however, I definitely have. So I'm going to let you know how faithful an adaptation it is, what, if anything, has been changed. I'm going to let you know how this has been realized on stage, whether or not that worked for me, and like I said, whether or not it lives up to My Neighbour Totoro. Stay tuned to find out. In the meantime, I would love to hear from all of you as well. If anyone has seen this already in person at the London Coliseum in London, let me know what you thought of the show. This was also live streamed from Japan when it was originally produced. If anyone saw that production, I'm gathering that what you saw was largely the same, if not identical, because like I said, this is also performed in Japanese. Or if anyone saw it in person in Japan, let me know what you thought about it there as well. In the meantime, as always, if you enjoy this review video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of my upcoming West End and Broadway reviews. And if you're listening to this in podcast form, then hello, I'm wearing a lovely jacket. I'm sorry that you won't be able to enjoy that if you can't see me. You will be pleased to know, however, that I am about to cut right to the chase. Let me tell you what I thought about Spirited Away, starting with what it's actually about. So, Spirited Away is a 2001 Japanese animated film directed and written by animation legend Hayao Miyazaki for Studio Ghibli. It is not only one of their most popular films of all time, but one of the most globally popular animated films of all time. It apparently held the record for the highest grossing Japanese film in history for something like 19 years. It also set various Academy Awards records. I believe it was the first hand-drawn anime and non-English language recipient of the Academy Award. Now, the film follows a young girl named Chihiro, who is in the process of moving house with her parents. She's a little resentful about the fact that she's having to move schools and leave her childhood life behind. All of this is interrupted, however, when they get lost and head through a mysterious tunnel, which, FYI, never the thing to do. Certainly not if you find yourself in an animated film. You've now been warned. And after what I'm going to describe in a spoiler-free way as a series of events, she finds herself transported to this fantasy realm and this fantastical bathhouse location where spirits come to be cleaned and to relax. This ties in with a bit of an environmentalism theme, which is quite light-handed in this film compared with a lot of other Studio Ghibli stuff, but it is something that runs through a lot of the Miyazaki Studio Ghibli films. Because you have this bathhouse location where essentially they're taking spirits, many of them spirits from the natural world, like river spirits, and they are helping to clean them. There is one customer who is perceived to be a stink spirit because they have this terrible stench and they are dragging loads of trash with them and covered in mud. And it turns out they are just a river spirit who has been filled with so much debris. A later plot point doesn't really hinge on the revelation, but notes that a river from Chihiro's childhood that she fell into once when she was younger has since been, I was going to say demolished. Can you demolish a river? Filled in, I guess, to make way for housing. The film also kind of lampoons Western consumerism. It portrays a lot of Japanese culture, a lot of religious and historical and cultural ideas. But there are also, to my mind, a couple of tie-ins with classic stories like Alice Through the Looking Glass, what you may know as Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and as well, and I'm going to commit to this, I think it's also a bit of a Wizard of Oz story. Hear me out, because I said this the other day and nobody believed me, but you have this girl who is a little bit resentful at the beginning. She's not completely appreciative of her parental figures, who in this instance are actually her parents. She's transported to a fantasy realm. She makes friends along the way, but yeah, she also has to complete tasks. She has to go on a physical journey. She finds herself tasked with returning the stolen property of a witch by a different witch, which is very Wizard of Oz, a task that she completes with the help of 3 friends by going on a journey. She takes the train rather than following a yellow road, but all of the signs are there. Ultimately, and I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler for the ending, so you can skip ahead of this if you don't want to know about it, but when she is returned to the real world and everyone wakes up, it's as though it never really happened, even though time has passed, but her parents can't really understand why. So there is a little bit of the wonderful Wizard of Oz to it for sure. To compare this to My Neighbour Totoro, a great deal less happens in Totoro or has as much meaning behind it. Here there are many more characters who have their own agendas. Everything is fairly straightforward, but because there is this language barrier situation and you're reading titles to the side of the stage, which I'll explain a little more about in just a moment, I do think it's probably beneficial for you to watch the film or have some knowledge of the film prior to seeing this stage production if you want to be fully engaged with the plot. If you just want to have a fantastic, sumptuous visual experience, then it matters a little bit less. And the plot is abstract and fantastical enough, with a lot of tangential characters who don't really serve much of a purpose and aren't really explained. So again, it helps to have seen the film. I had fully forgotten how many times I watched this film in childhood until we're about 20 minutes in, and I was thinking, oh, I know this really well. Like, I've seen this film upwards of a dozen times in my life, to the point that I think I probably could have followed it and occasionally was without looking at the titles at all. However, unless you really know the thing very well or have watched it really recently, which may be the way to go, you will probably find yourself looking at those titles. And I'm going to say something unusual. I think it's better to sit further back, because the further forwards you are, the more you have to turn your head like you're at a fantasy theatrical tennis match to actually see the titles that are way over there on the side. And if you're further back, then it's sort of still within your field of vision. Granted, the titles themselves will be smaller, but I think they were clearly broadcast enough that everyone in the auditorium ought to be able to see them. Or something else you might consider is being more of a side angle, because then again, in your field of view, you'd have that title on the other side as well as the stage there. I just think the more central and forwards you are, you're going to have so much happening in front of you, the titles are going to be way over there to the sides. If you're sat in a higher level, they also have other places where the titles are shown as well to make sure that you can see them, so do not fear. But I would also say that because of the nature of this plot, it being a little more abstract, it's a little less heartfelt than My Neighbour Totoro, which in the emotional moments of it is really gripping and is really talking about like grief and fear and loss and concern and childhood uncertainty and despair. And I don't think there's quite as much of substance in Spirited Away. One of the most striking moments in the story is just a moment of sudden crying that isn't really verbally explained anyway, so it doesn't lose anything in a language barrier. There are comparatively far fewer moments where characters articulate themselves emotionally, so much as just talking about what's happening. Like, I need to get a ticket for the train that goes on the water so I can go and return this magic seal, and I crushed a slug and the soot's alive, and like there's a dragon, and like there's magic paper planes flying through the sky. Like, it's just not quite as emotionally sincere because it's fantastical. So I think the language barrier matters less. I think I would have had more of an issue accessing something like My Neighbour Totoro, where the words are going to be slightly more important. Spirited Away is more about the visuals, and Totoro has its moments. A lot of Totoro is like depicting ordinary everyday life with beautiful puppetry, and then occasionally depicting these fantastical characters. Spirited Away, as soon as we get to this realm, is fantastical then throughout. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about how they physically bring this to the stage. Hopefully you're also seeing beautiful production images in this review as well, but I'm going to tell you that as part of the next section, where I let you know what I thought of this and how it works in comparison with My Neighbour Totoro. So as a big picture commentary here, it is still jaw-droppingly visually impressive. It is still mind-blowing that they have managed to bring an animated story so faithfully to the stage. And this is the part of the review where I tell you that they pretty much just show the thing frame for frame, or they expand on it a little bit. Very little is cut from what I can recall. They very faithfully just bring these iconic visual moments from the film to the stage. They try and recreate almost everything down to the tiniest little details, with a couple of differences that I'm going to highlight in just a moment. But what I want to say is that because it's fantastical characters throughout, we occasionally lose a little bit of the impact that Totoro managed to deliver. And also, the puppetry is a little bit less whimsically realized. In My Neighbour Totoro, they were playing with the idea that you could see these puppets, and there was the occasional little tease of the fact that you could see the puppeteers and you knew how it was happening, and they weren't really trying to hide that. And you had this incredible curtain call sequence where you have the puppeteers bowing without the puppets and then nodding to the theatricality of it all. And that, I think, may have been the Royal Shakespeare Company influence, because it felt inherently theatrical. Spirited Away feels a little bit different, where it feels like it could be really incredible theme park theatre, because we are realizing this beloved animated film beautifully on stage, incredibly well on stage, and mind-blowingly. But for the most part, they do a lot to try and hide the puppetry, so it doesn't really have the same kind of whimsy. They're just trying to be visually impressive the entire time. I think inherently also because of the story and the differences highlighted within the story compared with something like Totoro, it doesn't have that same simple vulnerability and that same sort of universal feeling of like the love that you remember for your parents and for your family. That doesn't come across as strongly in Spirited Away as it did in Totoro, so I think it doesn't feel quite as emotionally involving. I have some more thoughts, but to contextualize those, I need to tell you a little bit more about how they deliver certain things, because some of it has been more theatricalized. There are the occasional characters that they really try and recreate, like shot for shot, like Yubaba. The character looks pretty similar, and there are these moments in the animated film where she grew a giant head, and they do that with puppetry and this giant puppeteered head. There's another character in the film who works down in the boiler room who has multiple different arms. His name is Kamaji, and you can see the people on stage puppeteering his different hands, and there are a lot of different hand jokes, like with lots of like high-fiving multiple times and that happening. I don't remember that from the film. He's sort of a lot more stern and this grandfather type figure to Chihiro in the film when she ends up getting a job in the bathhouse so that she can't be harmed by the witch who runs the place, naturally. He's depicted in a way that's slightly more silly in the stage version, and I think a lot of it tonally just shifts ever so slightly from the gravity of the film and some of the weight of the film to being just a little bit more on the light side. The more anthropomorphic characters like Chihiro and like Haku, and also Lin, as well as Chihiro's parents in the beginning, they are just depicted by performers. You have some characters like No Face, who is somewhere behind me over there, as well as the Radish Spirit, who I just love, who are really recreated as we see them in the animated film. And then many of the other spirits, I would describe their theatricalization as being more from the Lion King school of thought, because they're not straight recreations of how we see them in the animated film. They are embellished theatrical versions of that. It feels more like how the Lion King creates animals on stage. This happens with the spirit guests at the bathhouse, but also in a couple moments of the show where, not unlike in the Lion King actually, we have performers playing rock formations and lampposts, which doesn't feel familiar of the film. Maybe there's some little mini passing scene that I've missed here, But at the beginning, it's used just to suggest the idea of Chihiro entering into a fantasy realm where things may not be as they seem, very Alice down the rabbit hole style. And all of that is fine, but what we don't really get is a cohesive and overall theatrical premise about how the show is being realized, because different things are established in different ways. The one big problem that they have is water. And this is set in a bathhouse in a town or an area, I guess, that floods at a certain point during the film. And she goes on this iconic train journey through this flooded area of water. It's beautiful. And that's the kind of thing they can't really recreate, or they can't really conjure the beauty of in the same way, because they don't use any real water on stage. They have these enormous bathtubs, they have this big pipe that lowers down, and they have a lot of, like, I guess, smoke or dry ice that comes out of it, which is a cool visual effect, but what we lack is the actual water. We use a sort of a wafted film thing that gets brought over the top in puppetry style. Again, it suggests water without really capturing it. That is less of a problem than when they're talking about the flooding and this whole train journey scene, because we get the beautiful music behind it, which I will say sounds just gorgeous. And when they bring this little train set in and you have Chihiro and her friends sat on it traveling to a new location, there is a flat that comes down behind them on which the traveling world behind them is projected to suggest movement, but it doesn't really convey the same idea. There's also a handful of moments where they mention a river. I think Chihiro's parents are like, there's a river here where there wasn't before, and they gesture at the orchestra pit. And if there was something they could do with introducing a river somehow or closing over the orchestra pit, which I dare say may cause its own problems, but I just think that it would help for us to actually be transported into this fantasy world. When you enter into the auditorium, it's just gorgeous, and they have all of this greenery growing out from around the sides of the stage. And if there was some way that they could reveal that when they are transported to this other realm, I think that would be even more of a stunning moment. We lack kind of really stunning moments like that. There is one little cool flight bit that is a real highlight, but aside from that, there aren't that many moments that shock us, because everything is just stunning and gorgeous and quite impressive throughout. I think Totoro managed to grab our hearts by doing this and ebbing and flowing with excitement, and there's a lot of downtime in Totoro as well. We really have to wait for those revelations, and in this, you know, we start up here and then we get a little bit higher and then we stay there for a long time while a lot of people potentially try and work out what's going on. There are some shots that are recreated really impressively, really well, when the not stink spirit is revealed not to be a stink spirit, and they pull all of the trash out of him, and then you have this god face rising up out of the bathtub and then flying all around. That is probably the highlight moment of the entire thing for me. There are other moments that don't work quite as well. Chihiro running down the steps by doing it on the spot and trying to suggest that she's going down a lot of steps. I just don't think we need that detail from the film. If you can't recreate that in a way that seems tense and scary, then why even put it in? Just have her like slowly and tentatively walk down the steps getting nervous. It didn't seem like we needed to fill that time for a set change either. Maybe we did, I don't know. Also, the parade of spirits going into the bathhouse in the first place, this just took way too long. This was a conspicuously long scene, and it's a long show because of moments like this, where they're just slowly walking across the stage and then getting onto the bridge that was at the other side of this massive London Coliseum stage, and then they're walking up the bridge, and it got a little bit painstaking. There are a handful of moments like that where things just get a little bit overplayed, but there's also, like I said, so much that is good and really impressive. We have soot sprites again, just like in Totoro. These are really brilliantly puppeteered. They're a combination of puppeteered soot sprites and ones that are on a little pulled along track along the floor, and the way that they create the impression of them all realizing that Chihiro will do their work for them and all pretending to be overwhelmed by their workload is very sweet and very funny. This is going to be another light spoiler again, skip ahead if you don't want it. I really like the way that they did some of these pig transformations. A lot of the show is quite slow in the way it builds its puppetry, in the way it builds its visuals, and you understand where they're coming from and you understand how it's happening, and it's not particularly fast-paced, but it's like, and now this beautiful thing, and now this beautiful thing, and we can see where it happens. And then just occasionally, out of nowhere, you will get striking moments that suddenly happen. There's a moment where a rope suddenly appears, but in the hands of like 12 people at once, like the same one rope suddenly appears and they're all holding it out of nowhere. And I guess blinked for a fraction of a second and suddenly it was there and I have no idea how. Perhaps it's obvious and I'm being foolish, but to me it seemed like magic. There are also a lot of moments where pigheads, giant pigheads, appear from nowhere and then go back to nowhere. That's very cleverly done. Honestly, I did like almost all of the puppetry. I really liked the portrayal of No-Face. I wasn't convinced at the beginning. I thought the costume maybe just needed a little bit more fabric, but it's the growth of No-Face when he starts to encounter more guests in the bathhouse. I'm trying to avoid spoilers here, but this is a character who grows and becomes a little bit more villainous and becomes more visibly monstrous. The way they did that, really, really cool. Very faithful to the film, surprisingly faithful to the film, and really cool. It looked terrifying, it felt threatening. That was the kind of menace that I wanted from this. I got more menace from that character than from Yubaba and Zeniba. They were just giving me sassy, exasperated HWICs, that's head witch in charge. And I wasn't getting terror from them quite as much. You know what was legitimately scary is, and I get that like something has to be turned into the baby by Zeniba. If you haven't seen the film, this won't be making sense to you, but oh gosh, Yubaba, the witch who runs the bathhouse, she has a giant baby who she keeps sheltered from the world, Rapunzel style, and she also has, for reasons unbeknownst to me, 3 heads that jump around and like form a totem pole. And at one point, her sister Zeniba, they don't get on, turns the baby into a hamster and turns the heads into the baby. However, the baby is portrayed quite sweetly on stage, and when it's turned into a hamster, that's very sweet as well. I'm very familiar with the animation in the film. That's all very cute. The heads are portrayed by a man in underwear whose face is painted green and who is holding 2 green puppet heads on his hand so he can like make a totem pole situation. Why he can't just be dressed in the same outfit as the other puppeteers that's like, you know, more subtle, and you can actually like, I guess, train your eyes to try not to see his body, or like a little bit of suspension of disbelief, whatever. The fact that he is nearly naked, it makes it just like all the more conspicuous. That felt like something that didn't really translate culturally from the original production, and is one of the few oddities in like, that's definitely not in the original film. Oh, speaking of No-Face, another moment that didn't like translate as well shot for shot, and it's one of my favorite visuals in the film, is when a frog appears from him, lands in the water, comes to its senses, and then begins swimming away like a frog. Again, because we don't have water, that just sort of got puppeteered in midair. It was still funny the way that the frog just didn't really react, but you don't get the same visual that you do in the film. They don't actually call No-Face as a name much. They acknowledge him to be a No-Face, and I think someone else says, "You must be the No-Face." I think it's only said twice, but previously in the film, Zeniba calls him by this name and says like, "No-Face, you're really good at this. How did you learn?" I think they're like knitting or crocheting or something. Sewing? Are they sewing? Honest to God, I don't know the difference. I just remember they go knit 1, purl 2, knit 1, purl 2. I've also said stink spirit twice in this review. They don't say stink spirit. And I can't remember what the subtitle of it was. It's not like trash spirit. Oh, a rotting god. I think they call it a rotting god, which it feels a lot more momentous. Another light spoiler moment, the character of Haku transforms into a dragon at one point, and this is portrayed using 2 different puppets, a smaller one and then a larger one. But when the larger one comes on, it's part of this like enchanted paper bird chase sequence, and we get the threat of that, and we can see that there's like a little bit of blood and red on the dragon. I just wish that the arrival of that dragon puppet had a little bit more majesty to it, was a little bit more of a moment, and we just kind of move from scene to scene to scene. But the vibe of the entire production is to very steadily introduce us to one different visual element at a time. Like the set will slowly revolve. It's like, and now we are showing you this, and then this appears over here, and now we're showing you this, and then that has to stop for something else to come in. And I wonder if the whole thing ought to be a little bit slicker, a little bit more fast-paced, shave 10, 15 minutes off of the thing, so that when you stop and do just focus in on this one moment, that can really be a moment. Otherwise, it's like, this is a very impressive puppet. And then after that's done, this is a very impressive puppet. And if you were to allow it to be a little bit more of an overwhelming feast of chaos for Chihiro and for the audience, then when we have those smaller moments or those really striking moments like, and we're just going to reveal Haku as the dragon and just show that, then I think that would be more powerful. There is also, though I have so much love for it, one sticky line of dialogue that I think is worse in the stage show, which is when Chihiro reveals to Haku that she's pieced things together and he may in fact be the amnesiac spirit of the river that she fell into when she was a child. And this is pretty dodgy in the film, I'll be honest, because she's flying on his back. He's come to pick her up from Zeniba's, and she's telling him that as a child she fell into the Kohaku River, but the river saved her from being drowned, and she feels the same kind of protective vibes from him. And so she says, I think your name might be Kohaku River, which just sounds clunky. In the stage show, they don't actually do that line, but they don't replace it with anything, so she just gets as far as telling him the story and being like, I fell into a river once but everything was fine, and then he's like Celine Dion because it's all coming back to him now. He's no longer a dragon, they're falling out of the sky, but nobody seems concerned about it because he's just thrilled to realize that he used to be a river. Honestly, we should all be so lucky. But all of this, I think, is to say it's one of the most visually impressive things I've ever seen on stage, and just because Totoro has already done it should not take away from are being cognizant of the fact that taking an animated film, a fantastical animated film, this has a lot more moving parts to it than something like Totoro. This is a lot harder to depict, and portraying it so faithfully on stage is a huge, huge undertaking. That we are in an age of theatre where we can recreate fantasy animation live on stage is crazy. The music also, like I said, absolutely beautiful and stirring and powerful throughout. That is what is going to give you the emotional impact, I think, more so than the dialogue, at least as a non-Japanese speaker. Anyone who speaks Japanese may be able to comment otherwise in the comments section, but it's the music that really punctuated the rise and fall emotionally of the show. Anyway, I've talked long enough about the production and the creative choices. Let me tell you about the cast members I saw at this specific performance. The most impressive, unsurprisingly, was Kana Hashimoto, who was playing Chihiro. I thought this was a very charming performance. I actually enjoyed Chihiro a lot more on stage than I ever have in the film, because I think in the film she comes across as being whiny and entitled for a lot longer. And in the stage version, I started to connect the dots with this storyline about Chihiro throughout the thing being a voice of conscientiousness and thoughtfulness and trying to do nice things for other people. Her generosity towards No Face ends up having implications, but ultimately is what saves him. The same with the river god, who is covered in bicycles and mud and whatnot. Similarly with Haku and with Yubaba and with Zeniba, she leads with generosity and thoughtfulness and kindness, and that's something I got a lot more from the stage portrayal of Chihiro. That one moment where she breaks down in tears was also really affecting, probably one of the few emotionally connecting moments of the show. But I did also very much enjoy Fu Hinami, who played Lin and Chihiro's mother. This is a really clever piece of double casting, again giving you Wizard of Oz for what it's worth, because the actress who portrays Chihiro's mother then portrays the person who ends up being sort of like a maternal or at least a big sister kind of a character to her when she is working in the bathhouse. This is another of the employees there who shows her the ropes. Literally, there are ropes involved, but I like the duality in terms of her going from this very sort of traditional maternal figure, slightly more conservative, to being more like down to earth and fending for herself and a little bit frustrated that she's having to show Chihiro around. But it's a lovely color in her when you start to see the concern that she has for Chihiro and the excitement that she has when Chihiro manages to find success. Wataru Daigo played Haku, who, and I have to tell you, I had a crush on in childhood, and to this day it's like, Chihiro, I respect that you're falling in love with this river, but like, even if he's not a river, I don't think that this male river is interested in female rivers. I'm putting that right out there. The hair is too precise. The movements are too balletic. I thought this was just a beautiful portrayal on stage. I loved everything that was happening here in terms of the physical characterization. It was so familiar of the animated character, that same sort of aloof, detached, but slightly protective quality I thought was still there, was still very charming. I fell in love all over again. I was happy. I also must mention Romy Park, who gives a pretty spectacular performance in the unsurprising dual roles of Yubaba and Zeniba. They are completely identical twin witches in the film. It makes sense that the same person would portray them on stage. There is a little difference in between those two portrayals. It's really just sort of one element of characterization, where one is more sort of agitated and frustrated than the other, who is more laid back, but they're still sort of equally dangerous. But I wouldn't call that a shortcoming of the stage production, because that's also exactly how it is in the film. There's really very little difference in these characters when they were animated. But it's a great villainous diva performance, and she is authoritative and commanding. Very much enjoyed this shrieking presence of hers. Tomoro Taguchi played Kamaji, like I mentioned before. A little bit more comedy with this character in the stage version. He's still stern at the beginning, but the fact that we actually see more of a softening from him in reaction to Chihiro and feeling sort of parental towards her and helping her by giving her the train ticket and everything, but also like giving out all of the high fives and just, again, just being like a slightly sillier version of that character. Another very charming performance. Finally, I also want to tell you about Hikaru Yamano, who played No Face, which for the most part, because this character doesn't really speak, was more of a physical performance, but really captivating. The early moments of No Face as a character who pretty much just sort of like floats through the world and stares ominously in the first half of the film. Traditionally, a lot of the sort of tortured movement, it seemed to suggest a sort of a pain, and I think it did a lot to further develop the motivations of this character that are always a little bit clouded, or at least have been for me. What came through, even with the character's more malicious acts later on in the piece, was that everything seemed to be motivated by a sort of a pain and by a longing, and that's what this performance was leading with, which I thought was fascinating. Really, really beautiful work. I mean, the entire company really deserve a tremendous amount of applause, just like in Totoro, because they have to work cohesively as cogs in the giant machine that is this show to bring about so many of these characters. It really is an enormous act of collaboration. In the spirit of which, I would like to tell you the names of some of the creatives who have brought this visual epic to the stage. So the film has been adapted by Maoko Imai and John Ked, who has also directed this production. It features the score by Joe Hisaishi. The remarkable set has been designed by John Bowsaw, the beautiful costumes by Sachiko Nakahara. Satoshi Kuriyama is credited with the projection design, which is another important aspect of this set, though it isn't necessarily hugely reliant on projections, which I appreciate. And one of my favorite creative aspects of this, the puppetry design and direction, was done by Toby Ollier. And that is just a drop in the ocean of the brilliant creatives and crew and company working on this piece. Like I said, it's an incredible act of collaboration. It is clearly vast. Many of those names do appear in this giant program, but there is tremendous, beautiful, careful work that has been done to bring Spirited Away to the stage. And for everything I can tell you about the moments where it really works and the moments where it doesn't quite work, that is inherent to the vision of what they were trying to achieve. And I think they did exactly what they set out to do, which is to faithfully make this animated film happen on stage. That's exactly what it does, for better or worse. Largely, I found it to be really successful. It is still visually stunning, and if you have any kind of a relationship to this film, I think you're going to have a wonderful time at Spirited Away. And chances are, most of the people who have bought tickets selling out the London run have some relationship to the film already, so I don't think they will be disappointed. So there you go. Perhaps not quite the theatrical heavyweight that My Neighbour Totoro was, which managed to combine the nostalgia for the film with this whimsical theatrical approach that endeared it to the London theatre industry, but I do think that Spirited Away is going to be a huge success both for its fans as well as presumably at the box office. For now, that is everything that I have to say about the show, but as always, very intrigued to hear what you thought. If you go and see it in the West End, make sure to comment down below with all of your thoughts. Let me know what you think about it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel, or make sure to follow me wherever you are watching or hearing this review. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds. I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!